And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Alex Ansary launched Outside the Box TV in Portland, Oregon back in 2004, where he presented very controversial local and international issues to a cable access audience for nearly a decade until he followed his own warnings and left the West Coast. His work over the years has taken on a multifaceted view on our polarized society with topics ranging from the supernatural influence over human affairs, geopolitics, World War III, the sun's effect on human consciousness, and his spiritual views embrace the traditions of various religions and faiths, including some Gnostic views. His website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com, and here he is back on Coast to Coast. Alex, how have you been?
I've been doing great, George. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
Looking forward to this. Explain to us what a solar cycle is.
Right. Solar cycles on average are 9 to 13 to 14 years. And Galileo was one of the first to start studying them in the Western world, although the Chinese have been keeping sunspot counts for a long number of years. And it's through that data that individuals like Alexander Chizevsky out of Russia back in 1917, he was one of the first to start looking at the sun and the wars that were taking place when the sun was active at that time. But as far as sunspots themselves, Galileo was one of the first, and within our own society, the discovery of the aurora borealis being caused by the sunspots also occurred around the 1917 time period. So, it's only really in the last few hundred years that we've really begun to understand the science of the sun.
And as we begin to pick up and learn more and more, what are we beginning to conclude about these cycles?
Well, most people are on the wavelength, even Tucker Carlson, that we're vulnerable. We've been vulnerable for a long time to some sort of a solar flare kill shot, which Ed Dames has talked about for years.
Yeah.
And I've been discussing it. I've talked with Matthew Stein also, which has been on this show, and he put out a lot of good info about the 400 Chernobyl threat, the threat that we face. And I know that you've been trying to get something going so they do something about securing the grid. And I don't know if that's been done yet. So I know on one level, most people are waking up to that issue. But there's more to that. There's the climate. There are earthquakes, which Mitch Batros has been writing about for years, the earth changes. And then there's the cycles of war, unrest, and spiritual breakthroughs. And so one of the things that I've observed is that these eclipses also seem to be magnifying the solar cycles or the strength of the sun, waking it up, if you will. I noticed this back around October, around the previous eclipse, and we're seeing it right now. In fact, there was a geomagnetic storm about 8 hours ago. There's a number of other authors. Chasing the Sun is another great book. I just read a book called The Sun, A Biography. Basically, the sun is 93 million miles away, and they continue to send out satellites for years. They've been trying to get closer to the sun to get more information on it. And then there's 11-year cycles that you know of, and then there's the longer cycles that Maurice Cotterell talks of and how they influence the rise and fall of civilizations. Most people, though, don't know that when the sun is more active, there are more fights in the streets, there's more crime. Sometimes there's even more sexual assaults. Some of us, we may become more creative and spiritual, but for a lot of people right now, we're seeing it in the streets. And we also see wars and rumors of wars and invasions. And even right now with the situation in Haiti, there's talks about intervention. There's even talks about U.S. troops being 4 miles away from China. And so as the sun becomes more active this year, in 2024, as we head towards the peak, I expect that we're going to see more geopolitical tensions. But as far as what is the sun scientifically, there's lots of data. But from a spiritual perspective and a theoretical perspective, I do think that we come from the sun spiritually. And I do suspect that there is, and I want to touch on this tonight, a paranormal aspect to the sun. That is to say, when the sun is more active, when it's creating more geomagnetic storms, I perceive that we see more possessions here on the earth. People doing things that they normally wouldn't do. People going off, and we do see scientific evidence proving that there are more suicides and there are more homicides. and there is a higher amount of mental illness, or what is perceived to be mental illness, reported. So whatever's going on with this electromagnetic energy, it does affect us. But if you go in the average bookstore to the astronomy section or the science section, you won't find this type of data. But it is my goal to maybe in 5 years have a book that will be on the bookstore, will be on the bookshelf, and that it will be hopefully common knowledge. Because if you do look at some mainstream articles today, they're admitting the psychological health effects.
Alex, we know during a full moon that it has some kind of an effect on people. Think, because we've got so much water in our systems that there's some kind of gravitational pull from a full moon, and it affects people's brains. Might the sun do something like that as well?
Burl Payne is one of the individuals that I would refer people to next to Alexander Zizitsky. He's been discussing this for years and even promoted the idea of mass meditations to quiet the sun, which is interesting. But he suggested that when the sun is more active, it affects brain rhythms, circadian rhythms, and hormones. And I've become convinced that testosterone rates are far higher. In fact, I'm convinced that if they were to do studies on this, and if they were to gauge bodybuilders, powerlifters, martial artists' reaction time, that they would see more success. You'll also notice that certain fads in pop culture, like pro wrestling during the Desert Storm, late 80s, early 90s period, with all that energy and that solar maximum time period, had a lot of stuff going on. And so there's a positive and a light side, in my opinion, to both the solar maximum period and the solar minimum. Also, to some, grand solar minimum and grand solar maximum. So grand solar maximum has a side effect of lots of wars, invasions, and oppression, according to various authors, including one called Sasha Dobler, who has several books on the solar effects. Whereas the solar minimum, there's concerns about crop failure, there's concerns about cosmic rays, but historically, according to this author, it's also a time of more peace and stability. And I also think relationships, monogamy, that there's more stable relationships between men and women. Whereas in the solar maximum, I think there's more breakup, divorces, and things of that nature. So we're basically going into a period where I expect to see, and I'm already seeing signs of it, more births through more procreation, and many Native American tribes saw the aurora borealis as the new souls waiting to come into the earth. At the same time, you also see more wars and death and destruction through various means.
How long do these cycles last, Alex?
It's unknown exactly how long we're going to be in this somewhat grand solar minimum, which some people believe that we have been in at least since either 1980 or 2000. So some estimates are that we're going to be in that one for about 35 years.
Wow.
We really don't know what's going to happen, but on average, 11 years. It just ranges. Sometimes we have a longer cycle, sometimes it's shorter. Sometimes there's a double peak to the solar cycle, sometimes it's just single. We could see this current cycle stretch all the way out to 2026, the maximum, to 2027.
When you were with me back in 2019, you talked about your concerns about technology, 5G technology, which is now here. Are you concerned about these things still?
So 5G, smartphones, cell phone towers, I would consider this all unnatural electromagnetic energy. And I think when there's too much of it, our ancestors did evolve naturally without it, even though we're not dropping dead right now. Like, for example, today there was supposed to be a phone call to the hotel to do this, and the person is not mentally competent enough to transfer the phone call over, unfortunately. So what I'm noticing in society right now is due to this technology and a lack of nature and people getting out in sun and getting exercise. We could talk about mediating the effects of the solar cycle to prevent mental health symptoms, because I know a lot about that too. The life coaching aspect of not letting the energy of the solar cycles drive you insane. But unfortunately, a lot of people want to deny, maybe it's ego, who knows what it is, religious beliefs. A lot of people want to deny that there is an effect. And so the 5G is an unknown effect. It's fairly new, but I don't trust it. And combined with other things, lots of Wi-Fi, it's not healthy. So I do advocate, certain shielding techniques, from meditation, to rocks, crystals, sugarite, having grounding pads for your computer, just doing what you can to shield your energy. Certain necklaces are on your heart chakra, certain energy exercises like Qigong. So it's one thing to be aware of the conspiracy and the dark side, but I advocate that in this time, when the light is coming through with this eclipse energy, that we should harness the power of the sun and practice psychic self-defense. In a day and age where, frankly, a lot of people, they get overloaded with this energy, George, and I think that if they're not spiritual in some cases, that excess solar energy in some cases takes them over, and we end up with what Burl Payne has written about and others, even Carol Moore, the mass psychosis effect. And we're starting to see that now.
Absolutely.
And then if you want to talk later, there's some troubling trends I'm seeing on Twitter.
Okay, now can people shield themselves from these solar cycles?
Well, my belief is to embrace the solar energy and to know how you're affected by it. And I have a life history of making mistakes as a young man in Portland, Oregon. If you want to ask me about Portland, ask away. I know a lot about that place. And I care about that place, but it's troubled. And so if people aren't aware of how they're influenced by the solar cycle and they're a young man or a young woman, they could find themselves in, nymphomaniac situations, hopping from partner to partner, lots of drugs, alcohol, moving around, out of balance, ungrounded. You see, we have magnetite in the brain. They discovered this years ago in pigeons. And so it's not just whales and pigeons and animals that use the Earth's magnetic field to get around. We're also animals, too. We're intelligent animals, but we're also affected. So what I'm saying is this energy that's coming in is not destructive. It's life-giving. Okay, but if we don't do something positive with that energy, like working out, exercise, training, then we can develop some issues. And a lot of people in the current lifestyle in America, sedentary, on the computer, not physically working outside, a lot of people don't know how to shield. But at minimum, they can get on YouTube and start watching some tutorials. And on my Substack, I'm going to go over a few tutorials, and I have for years, but people should already know how to put up a shield, an auric shield, and the ground of the earth, and to utilize various techniques. And there's also a technique called Vipassana, which is an Indian meditation technique, which is based on just observing your breath without overreacting, and just going deeper and deeper into your awareness. So I advocate that people spend time under the sun, absorb the energy, and then go back inside, read, write, take time away from the computer and that blue light energy, and absorb that life-giving energy that, in my understanding, is the God force.
Interesting take. Alex, some people are concerned about another war with either Russia, China, or both. What do you think? So I began to become concerned about this in 2007. It's the Red Dawn situation. I interviewed a man that told me about 5 signs, basically, if this was to happen. And we're talking about the breach of the nation's defenses. One is China bringing the microchip with $100,000. Another is a major disturbance in the Mississippi. He talked about the whole world being turned against the U.S. He talked about Putin. He talked about it coming out of Russia and China and the West and East Coast, and Oregon, Idaho, California. This interview is on my Substack, like these states being vulnerable states. And the question that I had from my intuitive feeling, being from Portland, and the issues there is, what about women as far as human trafficking in such a disaster, knowing that it has gotten worse, as Sound of Freedom gets into, but it's much worse than what that movie portrays. And so back to the solar cycles. I began to become concerned about the mid-20s around 2012, 2013, when I spoke at Mark Passio's Free Your Mind conference and gave a 1-hour talk on the various ways we're affected by the sun, including even paranormal and UFO sightings and Earth changes, just touching upon a variety of things on other planets. And I'm concerned about the mid-2020s, or have been for years, even before I was aware of the solar cycles, and looking at RAND Corporation documents warning of a war by 2025 and doing war game exercises where, in fact, they downplay, in some cases, China's capabilities, which is concerning. And I've also seen lots of signs over the years from a conspiratorial perspective that a lot of the world's powers that be are in on it together. So my idea of the NWO
is what's being brought out now. Russia and China leading the NWO. I warned about it for years. People thought I was a nutter. Years and years and years and years, I said this NWO is going to include them, and this attitude that they are not involved in this, that it's just us, is just ridiculous. This potential 9/11 deception that your show has discussed for years and years was not just covered up by the U.S. alone. That's a lie. And I was always suspicious of RT, and I'll just stop there. So my conspiratorial understanding goes way beyond anything anybody's ever heard. And it has to do with why we have not been taught to be a little bit more concerned about some of these foreign nation states. And so what people need to know about China is they've already practiced coming to America in exercises with the U.S. It's earthquake drills they've done in the state of Oregon. There is news about Chinese police stations in America, but most people don't know that they trained in Leak City, Texas in 2011, and nobody said a thing about it.
And they're still here.
And they're still here, and there's a massive amount of property that's been purchased down at the border, and I have like a top 10 predictions, and I don't have 100 predictions. I have the same predictions I've said for years. So the spread dawn scenario is one of them. The human trafficking risk is another. The idea that the sun may come, the sun reset, the kill shot, if you will, that it's a God reset to arrest the robot apocalypse. That's not just me. That's also something some Sufis speculate, that whatever may be coming down the line from the sun will be the liberating force. Unfortunately, with the nuke situation, with the power plants, I don't know what we're going to do about that. But back to China. They also own a massive amount of land near Bend. And there's been also, why would we allow Yahweh to come in years ago if they were going to do what they did and surveil the American people? And now we have TikTok. And I do see a lot of pro-TikTok sentiment being pushed on Twitter. And that's its own discussion. I don't like what Twitter's doing. And I see a lot of things on Twitter that's amplifying the racial tensions towards various groups, not just one. And so in this time in which we're seeing this, I see China and Russia as playing their role manipulating big tech. I believe that China manipulates the YouTube algorithm at this point. I've seen things that are anomalies where I've been on Facebook and my account has changed, or the page changes to a Chinese language and then it changes back. Could just be a glitch.
Right in front of you.
Yeah.
Wow. And are you concerned about the legislation? Do you think you support it, the legislation to disband TikTok?
Well, I don't support TikTok, but there's concerns about the legislation going after free speech. And so those sentiments are valid sentiments, unless, of course, that's propaganda. But I don't support TikTok or the ByteDance Corporation, and people should basically get off their phone now. They shouldn't be asked to by the government. They should do it because you shouldn't support an immoral corporation.
Hold on for a second, Alex. We're at a break. We'll come back and chat more. And welcome back to Coast, George Norrie, along with Alex and Sarah. Alex, on April 8th, we're going to have a solar eclipse. Is that going to have any kind of effect on us?
Well, I'm concerned about false flags. And so there is a movie coming out also called Civil War. It's coming out on the 23rd. I think they're playing on that unrest energy. We have Devil's Comet overhead. And from experience, I know that comets can influence unrest. We're already seeing signs of it today with today's geomagnetic storm. We saw the riot down in El Paso, Texas. We also saw someone associated with the Clintons that has been reported dead. And let's see if this phone call transfer works. Hello? Are we able to do this? No? No one's on the line.
No,
so, yeah, this whole phone thing is unusual. I apologize to the audience also with the beeping. Definitely not a cell phone guy. Apologize. But as far as what we're getting into here, I think that we're in a volatile situation. Also with the U.S. on Russia's doorstep, and then with U.S. troops getting close to China, and then with North Korea making the threats that it's making, and Biden saying that Iran is about to attack the grid. All kinds of predictive programming is going on with Iran being the threat with the recent movie that came out on Amazon Prime that Obama was a part of, Leave the World Behind. So that's really interesting to see that. So I am concerned about the eclipse. They're telling people, the officials, to prepare with food and water in some of these areas because of the mass amount of people. I'm not convinced like other people, though, if there's going to be certain things going down the way they see it, but I am concerned about something. And the first eclipse, I'm just going to say this briefly, I feel like this whole thing has been orchestrated by a spirit of evil that likes to see humans sacrificed through war. So I see a spirit of evil orchestrating the Gaza events. And I want to point out that the strike on Yemen occurred on 1/1/24, exactly between the eclipses, meaning they, the military-industrial complex, is doing what they're doing specifically and strategically.
These events that occur because of the solar events, what is physically happening to the human body, if anything?
Well, there's what we can prove, and there's what we can't prove. On what we can prove, there are the studies, for example, out of Russia from 1947 to 1997. They did studies on suicides. And then there's other studies that have been increasing. Now you can look at mainstream admissions of insomnia, schizophrenia, other mental illnesses, irritability. And now in mainstream MSN.com articles, they talk about drinking water, getting exercise, avoiding sugar, avoiding coffee. So we're already getting to that point to where it's no longer woo-woo. And I've been called a strange person by managers of banks asking me what I do for a living. Say, well, I was on Coast to Coast last week and talked about this. Well, that's bizarre. That's really out there. And so it's unfortunate, but that's the point here. I want to see people in the mental health field upgrade their awareness of what's causing what they perceive to be schizophrenia. You know, if everybody that listened to Coast and the guests here talked to a therapist and said, well, I believe in aliens, or I believe in the unseen realms.
And ghosts.
They would be considered a schizophrenic. And I believe that this is the time in which we need to see the rise in the paranormal psychiatrist. That would be individuals that understand the possessions taking place, which were increasing even before COVID. Mm-hmm. Like 2019 was a big year for that. And so I'm concerned about possessions, to answer your question. As far as the eclipses, I think that's a spiritual time for all those of us that appreciate God, nature, the sun, community. It's also a time where people are looking for a victim. It's also a time where we're starting to see mob violence in aspects of the city. So I would exercise caution, and the best preparedness is spiritual preparedness. Do good deeds for others. Because I've met more than a few survivalists that lost the will to live, because they did not build their spiritual side. So it's physical preparedness on one level, where the preppers are at, but spiritual preparedness for dealing with the solar flares and the solar minimum that could be coming, and that has its own health complications. So spirituality is the answer. There's no way around it.
How quickly does it affect people? Does it take months? Or
That's a good question. Yeah, I think it could take place instantaneously. I don't think a geomagnetic storm anymore is needed. I think you can actually look at news of the sun erupting, X-class solar flares, and instantly see craziness on Earth without being able to scientifically explain it other than correlation. This happened. We saw it on Suspicious Observers. We saw it on Space Weather Woman or Coast to Coast, spaceweather.com, and then here it was on Earth. So I don't think a large geomagnetic storm is necessary. And Mitch Batros said many years ago on this show that we would get to this point where M-class solar flares would have the impact of X-class solar flares. So again, to the GSM crowd, even during a GSM, through the Earth's weakening magnetic field, the impact of the solar flares are getting stronger. And we still get solar energy several times a year, and March is one of those months in which we get an extra amount of solar energy.
We have sent a craft in 2018 to get close to the sun, to study the sun, and it's supposed to reach its area in December of this year. Is there anything sinister behind this, Alex? Are you familiar with this one?
I'm not familiar with that. I'm familiar with articles that they're beaming back solar energy from space to Earth. I don't know why. You see, there's several things that can cause a geomagnetic storm, and solar flares is not the only one. Space weapons could be one. And by the way, China has developed brain weapons that they say they're going to use on the leaders in Taiwan. What's to say they want to use that on us and already aren't?
And maybe it was tested in Cuba, remember?
But possibly. There's a lot of open talk now about the Havana syndrome, which is interesting. So years and years of TIs and people being treated like they're crazy, and now it's coming out. But I do want to say this. A lot of people in America and people from my channel, they think they're being gang stalked. They're convinced. I'm not convinced that they're just dealing with human beings. I am convinced that we're not alone in this reality, and that a lot of people don't really understand what's going on with them. Okay, so I would encourage people to look deeper. But, kind of this whole eclipse thing right now is starting to feel like a scene out of Ghostbusters. And so I actually took 3.5 years, by the way, after the last time I was on the show. I just left the internet for 3 years because I want to step back from the craziness that was occurring while we were conditioned, society, during the lockdowns, to get on the internet.
How did you pull back? Did you just disappear?
Well, I chose to just walk away. I dealt with targeting. I had to sell my land after the show. I had to move. I dealt with targeting due to my content. Don't think it was from a superstate nation, but from people that believe that we should just focus on the earth being flat and other things that I'm not going to get into. So I've seen the rise in sociopathic behavior within the conspiracy movement, and I'm going to write a book about it.
Have you been?
If people really want to understand why we're going to end up enslaved, they need to look in the mirror and look at the ways people behaved in the last days. They weren't at their best, and they fought every inch of the way against the truth, in my understanding, in my experience. And the people of Portland, Oregon, that's another thing. I care so much about that city.
It's a great town.
It's a great city. It has like a prana to it. It's almost like an ancient city. But unfortunately, due to corruption locally and Portlandia, the TV show, now you can't afford to live there due to Measure 110. There's a lot of people there that have been forced out of their communities, unfortunately, California, New York, other places. And so, hate to say the word cesspool, and I'm back on Access TV trying to reach people in Portland so they have another voice of reason other than what they have right now. Portland needs more. So I'm worried about it. I want to move back, but I'm really concerned about how it's going to fare in this current geopolitical situation. Now, if people want to think about moving off grid, they need to do the homework now before waiting till last minute. And obviously, I would recommend aspects of Middle America and not the West or East Coast.
And you're still on YouTube, aren't you?
OTB TV News, but I recommend that everybody primarily go to this, alexansary.substack.com. And I want everybody to know that after the Coast to Coast interview, Google deleted 90% of all my comments. They deliberately downranked the 20-part series on the sun that I did after the show with you. Basically 15 hours, elaborating deeply on what I'm getting at. And so we're dealing with 400 views in a video. Views being rolled backwards.
See if that happens again.
I don't trust YouTube anymore.
Wow. Be careful.
So I'm glad to be here, and I just encourage people to do this. Pay attention to when the sun is active. Go to the proper website, spaceweather.com. I link to a few. And if you want to involve yourself in this research, it's open. You take a look at when the sun is active, and then you take a look at the world events, or when there's a geomagnetic storm, or when there's an eclipse or a comet. And I think the future is going to appreciate this work because after the passing of Burl Payne a few years ago, never met him, but I interviewed him after a stroke. He lost the ability to speak, unfortunately. And so his legacy, a lot of his stuff's in the Wayback Machine, actually. And yet so much of what he talked about in a lecture that I reposted the other day from 1990 is right on when he was discussing this during Desert Storm.
We're going to take calls next hour with Alex Ansary, so make sure you're part of the program. And his website that he just mentioned is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. What do you recommend, Alex, people do with their kids during this solar eclipse?
Well, it depends where they are. I mean, as soon as their kids are able to crawl, they should learn self-defense, not necessarily MMA, self-defense. As far as parenting, I'm actually going to blog about being a mindful parent because I grew up being abused, and I grew up becoming an addict by the age of 19, destroying my life, going to jail, and then becoming a truther. So I know something about what you don't do and how you can build yourself up from nothing. So I know that once a child has talent and ability, you nurture that child. If that child wants to learn an electric guitar or a different martial art, or to read a certain book, or to travel to a certain place, or shows a certain aptitude, you don't crush that. Okay, so as far as like nurturing and growing, raising kids in the city, if people are able to go off grid, then I recommend that. Yeah. So, but for people in the city, I recommend that people start building community. And one of the ways people can do that, I just want to cite Dion Fortune again briefly. that if people want to look into that, it's the idea of mass meditations, and I don't believe that Christianity is exempt from this. And so I believe in teaching children about the future, not telling them about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, telling them about the nature of evil, telling them, even if you believe the official story of 9/11, tell them that overall what has been done to these foreign lands is no bueno, is wrong. And so they don't have to become a conspiracy person or a snowflake, but to understand that what's been done for a long time isn't good and doesn't keep us safe. I'm actually concerned for refugees in America because I'm afraid that one day they're going to find themselves in a bad situation if some events come about.
Yeah.
So the prayer that I want to invoke, I don't think we can stop the evil. I don't really even think we can stop the invasion if it's set to be. But what we can do is pray for each other. What we can do is fight tooth and nail to do what we do to evolve beyond this reality. Because the more I come across lower conscious, low voltage souls, as Maurice Cotterell calls them, the more I feel I'm in a simulation, like a test to overcome. So this fight against this tyranny and the simulation isn't meant to be easy. And I disagree with a lot of people on the left and the right that act like they're winning.
But you believe in prayer.
So I believe in studying more so now than ever comparative religion. I'm not Muslim, but I believe in the teachings of Christ and aspects of Sufism, which is not Orthodox Islam. I believe in aspects of Gnosticism. I've discussed the archons for about 10 years. I made about 300 videos on them, and I'm going to make a book compiling everything I've said about the unseen realms. And so I believe the answer to the unseen realms and the way they attack is through prayer. And there's certain things, obviously, that attract negative entities to people. So if people can go out and do a prayer, do a clearing, but if they don't remove the behaviors that's attracting the entities to begin with, the thought patterns, the thought forms, so on and so forth, then they're wasting their money. So those are things that I try to tackle while trying to encourage people to look at aspects of the world and the ancient world in a less judgmental way. There's a lot of beauty out there. In the conspiracy world, there's a lot of assumption that everything's Illuminati, everything's Freemason, and not everything. You can go far enough back, and you can reach a time in which the symbols were used for other purposes. For example, here's one. Okay, extremist groups have used certain symbols, like in Nazi Germany, but where those symbols come from? They didn't create those symbols. They borrowed those ancient source symbols.
And they weren't always evil symbols until they were abused.
And here's the thing. So the corporations get to use these symbols. The various groups and their private groups get to use these symbols, but I added one, which is the Sacred Cross, the Solar Cross, and try to get a Facebook group going, and AI shut it down right away. When are they shutting down the other groups? So it's like rules for thee, but not for me. So I believe in not necessarily God being called by a certain name, although some do, but I believe to be in a state of constant prayer. Now, some believe that God allows some people to be harmed. Some Muslims do. And even if that is the case, you should still stand up for them and your people, Christians the same. Sometimes it may not be God punishing them. And so these are things even if these things are happening, we are here on the earth to make things better, to not just allow things. And we're right now a planet-ending society that's in a trance. So back to the 5G. As long as we keep moving forward with these technologies, 6G, 7G, satellites going up, doing things, being affected by superstate nations, I don't at present see a future until the grid goes down and we're restored to nature. The vision that I have of the future is, unfortunately, a slavery coming because we're not going to be able to pay back the debt that's been put over our necks. And as far as the robots are concerned, they're fitting these robots with ChatGPT. And there's a lot of people that have been speculating, including myself, that AI is an entity, that these robots are going to be taken over by these evil spirits. So there is a connection, absolutely, with these solar cycles, even if we don't find out or understand it now, and the paranormal influence.
Can this be stopped?
Well, no, we can't stop solar cycles. I don't think that we can stop evil in this plane of reality because this reality is where it is. We're here for a reason. And this is not paradise. This is some sort of a quarantine realm, some sort of a prison planet, if you will. Purgatory, that's the word that I was looking for. So we're here for a reason, and I don't see things being fixed overnight, but we can partake in a lifestyle of trying to bring people to the true light away from the false light. And in doing so, maybe we can crack the codes of the matrix like the never-ending story and get through the ninth gate out of this reality. That's my speculation.
All right, stay with us, Alex. We're going to hit a break at the top of the hour. We will come back and take calls with you next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with Alex Ansary. Alex's website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Alex, if there were no solar cycles, what effect would there be on human behavior?
Yeah, good question. If the solar cycle died down to an extreme minimum, we would have a mass depopulation event over time until it came back up to a maximum, as Maurice Cotterell has described. When we go into a deep solar minimum, there's more miscarriages. People are less fertile. So, yeah, maybe we wouldn't be here without a certain level of magnetism. But yes, there's definitely something mysterious about this. There's something that seems to intimidate people when looking at the sun. And to me, it's a spiritual experience to be humbled by something that I do believe to be created by the Creator.
All right, let's go to the phones. Bill, truck driving in North Carolina to get us started. Hey, Billy.
Hey, how's it going, Alex? How is it going, George?
Okay.
There's a good. Hey, there's a conspiracy. It doesn't get much attention. It's called the Shen Yun conspiracy. It's about that dance troupe that you see billboards for it, mainly in what we call conservative, particularly cities. But you see the billboards, and it's supposedly China before communism, and it's a giant, just dance show, highly choreographed. But supposedly, and it kind of makes sense, right? China before communism in, mainly Republican areas. But supposedly it is the exact opposite, subliminally. Subliminally, it's encouraging the watchers to favor, state rule and centralized government. Do you think that, have you heard of it, and do you think that has something to do with superstate propaganda?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with that specific, but yeah, I saw it a few months ago.
How do we avoid any kinds of conflict with this, Alex? Is it avoidable?
Maybe if we didn't have the people in power, maybe if we weren't in this type of reality under whatever type of control we're under. But I don't get too into politics. I'm nonpartisan. I've never really been. I got into the Ron Paul thing for a while, pretty hardcore in 2012, between 2008 and 2012, but that was it. I really would like to, if I had my way, I wouldn't be in a city. I would be living in an off-grid community. We would be living we would be living with power, but we wouldn't be dependent on the grid. And we wouldn't be all necessarily believing the exact same thing, and we wouldn't be dependent on a police force. And so having lived off-grid without power by myself 4 years without a gun, and having a difficult time getting along with other off-gridders that were addicted to Facebook and sometimes fake conspiracy news that wasn't legitimate, I really wish sometimes that I would grow up in the 60s and 70s, to be honest with you, and your generation, George, not mine.
It was an interesting
My generation's a lot more difficult to get things going with all the cell phones and all the technology and the QR codes. And so I'm like an older generation. I was born in the wrong time.
Did you ever time travel?
I think so, yeah. I often say I'm not working for the people of this planet anymore. I'm working for the women of 2075. I'm convinced that whatever information I'm creating will be read in 100 years. There's no doubt in my mind that the stuff that I'm talking about is legitimate, and it's because of mind control, algorithmic programming, shadow banning, and interference like tonight, where we can't even get a phone call to go through, reminded me of something out of Alex Jones's Endgame, to be quite frank. Because
you sound good on your cell phone.
But the phone wasn't working. So it's like I feel like this info, there are many things I've experienced that has been interference in my life.
Have you felt threatened ever?
I felt that my information upset people that you would think would be a little bit more tolerant. A lot of people talk about the government, the big bad government, the cops, as the ultimate enemies and threat. And while I see that, and we talk about those things, it's unfortunately been ignorant people at the grassroots level that's been the issue, not always necessarily government. So people want to fix things, they need to start resolving things around them. And so, like the people of Portland, Oregon, for example, my advice to them with their homelessness epidemic is to stop expecting the government to give everybody permanent housing. I'm going to say it again. If there's all this land out there in the U.S., we should be changing the land use codes to get away from the 5G and living in nature the way our ancestors lived. And so I'm going to advocate that. And as things get worse, like with COVID, for example, the lockdowns, the land value doubled in Colorado after 2022.
That's amazing.
It's going to keep going up. So people, if they're thinking about moving off grid, think about where things will be in 10 years' time in Colorado, value-wise.
All right, let's go to Todd in Bellevue, Washington. Welcome to the show. Hey, Todd, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Norrie. Now, there was an airport director who was killed by the FDF, the same people who killed the Branch Davidians at the beginning of the Clinton administration. And this man, he was the airport director of the Bill and Hillary Clinton airport. And the ADF came out to his house, and he was shot dead in the head. Now, you know, it's like Extreme said, where there's smoke, there's fire. So how do you feel about this continuum of assassinations by the alcohol and tobacco, federation?
You've been tracking that story, Alex?
Yeah, I just saw it before showtime along with the riot down at the border. So with SOAR maximum comes also authoritarian rule and crackdown, whether you see it as far left or far right. You see more people try to control others. So assassinations is obviously a part of that because someone might get emotional. Someone might get emotional also because someone with the solar flares has the inspiration to speak their truth, maybe be a whistleblower, a Snowden or something like that. So some of the arguments and fights and conflicts that come about from the SOAR maximum is when others have the strength in them to speak their truth and others can't handle it. Some people will take it to the point of murder. And so if you Google also SOAR maximum and homicide murder, you'll find studies there. And in future blogs, I'll be analyzing those studies and making videos. It's
uncanny of the tie-in between the solar situations and the strife and conflicts that happen.
Right. And so we can also see when the next cycle will be, we don't have a prediction yet, but it'll be after 2035, 2036. And so if we don't have this massive World War III situation, I'm still convinced the powers that be are planning that. As I said in 2019 on the show, people are more apathetic in the minimum, so they push forward certain agendas. So what do we have the next year? The lockdown. And also, I didn't get time to say this yet, the George Floyd protests kicked off after a massive solar flare. May 29th, 2020, right? How many other people mention that? This is the type of stuff that's on my radar. And so I consider this to be my specialty. Other solar researchers are going to focus on just looking at the sun and going, ooh, ah, and that's what a lot of people want.
Sure.
Me, I feel the solar flares when they're active.
How did you put two and two together with solar flares?
By being born in this world during solar maximum, 2 years after Afghanistan was invaded, 2 months before Mount St. Helens erupted in Portland, Oregon, in a solar maximum discotheque period. Around May 1979, my parents getting together, around the time Burl Payne was doing his meditations, just a connection I made. Born a week after Solar Max, the satellite, was launched by NASA. And then my website, by the way, is solarmaxnews.com. There's more data there. Just a coincidence. It was in 2009 that I wrote my Nexus article. So that already went, not viral, but it was physically printed in Australia. So that was confirmation that I was onto something. But like I said, I struggled after dealing with my dad's physical abuse, and I moved out of the house. And it was the late 90s in Portland, and the solar cycle ramped up, and a bad guy came into my life and threw me a bad substance right as the solar cycle was ramping up. Now, at that time, ODs were off the charts in that city. And later, when I quickly ditched that, very quickly, I found out that there's cycles to those things that people in drug and alcohol recovery know nothing about. So I believe my information isn't just for survivalists, preppers, spiritualists, but the mental health field, police department, judges, the court system, the medical field. Here's a short story. So I am low income, so I go to a dental school to get an implant. My heartbeat is too high several weeks ago, right? Because I had coffee and there's a magnetic storm. Magnetic storm speeds up the heartbeat and the blood pressure. Well, they want to argue and say coffee doesn't do that, and they don't know about the magnetic storm, so they discontinue my patient status and throw me out.
How fast was your heartbeat, Alex?
Oh, it wasn't that much higher. It was just, I don't remember the exact amount, but I don't think it was extreme. But it was above. They have at schools levels so someone doesn't have a heart attack when they do an implant.
Right. They don't want the responsibility.
A subtle amount that goes above the normal that they don't. So when I explained it to them, they took me back. But also, I think that they emotionally overreacted to me asserting myself. So when you have solar flares, you'll have conflicts, road rage, because people may be intolerant to someone else just speaking their truth. So just be very watchful of people's interactions, relationships. And so the importance of learning about the solar cycles is so that people that have inclinations towards violence, abuse, tempers, if they want to get better, they should learn about meditation, how to calm themselves down. If they're going to do something like a substance, what's actually going to be natural and helpful to them, like ashwagandha, or that may not be the exact enunciation, or there's valerian root. There's many natural things that people can take in conjunction with meditation other than, trusting Big Pharma.
Yeah, valerian root will calm you down. Big Pharma's taking
advantage of people that now have mental health issues, and that's its own show. Yeah.
Let's go to Joe, Long Island, New York. Joseph, take it away.
Yeah, hi, Alex. A couple of questions. First on the sun and behavior. I had spent some time in Alaska. I had worked at a national park, and I went to, at one point it was like over 100 degrees, and I went to purchase sunscreen, and they said, well, we really don't carry it up here because the sun comes in at a lesser angle, and you really don't need it, but it was over 100 degrees. But my question is, the sun is not as strong, and there, places like Alaska as opposed to the equator, does that affect people's behavior? You look at, Miami, Mexico, Acapulco with these spring breaks, and people, are drinking to excess, partying right on the beach. But that's right in the middle of the sun. And I do wonder even what the ancient Romans thought of the sun and how it affected behavior.
Well, we don't know about the Romans, but what do you think about the equator and being close to it, Alex?
Well, one of the things that I noticed from one of the recent books I read on the solar behavior by Sasha Dobler is that people have certain complications when they move from one area to another, like an equator-based part of the planet to maybe a northern latitude. And so they've done certain studies on Sweden and things of that nature. So when you move from one place to another and it has a different magnetism to it, you can maybe even be allergic to it. Or if you're from a northern latitude area and you haven't been to the equator and your ancestors are from a certain region and you just end up being born somewhere where it's not naturally the homeland of your genetics, you might feel better in a certain region. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but that is also something I talk about, knowing what is the right place in America or the world for you if you have an ability to move. And that's one of the reasons why I moved to Colorado. It wasn't just an off-grid thing. It was searching for that right spiritual type of a place. This is my idea. I made a whole video about this. It's the idea of writing a book and truthing your community where they are. You can do it anonymously. There's a number of ways you can do it. But you can truth your community through a book, a QR code, stickers that you leave around different places. Maybe try to address local corruption. If you're Christian and you're alarmed by what you perceive to be the satanic takeover of America, call it out and what the local churches are not discussing. Recently, a few years ago, it was 2017, there was the path of totality over Oregon. And so we have an X basically forming over the U.S., and who knows what effect this is going to be. There's been a lot of speculation for years about earthquakes. I experienced a lot of negative things in that period, which would take longer to describe. I would just simply sum it up as a lot of negative energy and paranormal. So I became convinced after 2017 that a portal opens And so if you look at it, it may not be a good thing. And I don't know if there's any documented history of people looking at the eclipse. Of course, they didn't have protective eyeglasses, but they did makeshift certain things in the past, like Galileo did, to look at the sun. But yeah, I don't know if the ancients did that. It was seen as a omen. I believe that Jesus was crucified during the eclipse, or the sun became blackened between the 6th hour and the 9th hour at the skull. That's how the Bible puts it.
And something happened with the sun with the miracle at Fatima.
Yeah, now that's new to me. That's interesting. Still looking into that.
Check into that. A lot of things. Check into that. You're going to find that fascinating. Where thousands of people said the sun came down. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. I think what it was a paranormal UFO experience. Yeah.
Now, if you want to talk about paranormal experience, like Dion Fortune and others have engaged in mass meditations. The small town of San Luis, Colorado, engaged in group prayer when they were being attacked by the Ute Indians. And according to town legend, they manifested a massive protective being that scared off those Indians from the tribe. The point is whether it be Dion Fortune or somebody else, there seems to be the power of collective prayer in a time of emergency. So I've wargamed the spiritual response for many years as to how people could collectively create a peaceful energy. Burl Payne speculated on if humans together could quiet the sun.
We're going to come back in a minute with you, Alex, and let's get your website out one more time. The name of his website is Alex Ansary, ANSARY.substack.com. We've got it linked up for you at coasttocoastam.com to make it easy. His book that he wrote back in 2018 is called Solar Maximum, links to cycles of war, societal change, and personal transformation of consciousness. We'll come back with him and wrap things up in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And thank you, Alex, for being on the program. His book is called Solar Maximum. His website is his name.substack.com, linked up at coasttocoastam.com, and he's got a presence on Facebook as well. Alex Ansary, Ansary. Take care of yourself. And watch out for those solar cycles, Alex. Now, they say your past life affects who you are today. Past life regressionist Barbara Lamb tells us more. Barbara, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, George. I'm delighted to be here.
And how are you these days?
I'm fine. Really busy these days.
How did you get involved in hypnotherapy? How did that first start for you?
Well, first of all...
the last couple of weeks, there's been an accelerated level of articles coming out about cyber warfare, about these units the military's creating and housing them in Air Force bases to fight the future of warfare, which is beyond what's taking place in the battlefield. They're running these exercises at the same time that we're seeing major power outages around the world in major cities, which they're claiming hackers are responsible for. Now, the question is, how are we going to secure our own communications when this current grid of information goes down, this current database known as the Internet, which we do know now was something that was created by the government in the 60s. And we've forgotten that. We've forgotten that this platform is moving into a new world to where they can easily force us onto Internet 2. They're already announcing that thousands of our emails are being read on a regular basis, uploaded automatically to the server in the sky or some other database. It's very interesting to see how all of this progresses as we move closer and closer into a world where we can actually see parts of our Internet break down. And we're starting to ask ourselves, why is this happening? Is it really because they're running out of space? Or is it because there's a bug in the system that's designed to be there? Rather than debate about internet censorship or where the internet's going, I think the time is already past for us to seriously begin a real face-to-face discussion about alternative communications. How are we going to get information out to people in the community when the platform of the internet goes down? I have a couple suggestions for keeping your ear to the ground, like a wind-up, shortwave radio. That way, through the ionosphere, you can pick up transmission from Europe about what's happening in America if we're under martial law. And communications have been cut off to a certain degree. The AM/FM band, the television stations, unless, of course, they're running state media reports. You also want to look at two-way radios for you and your crew or whoever you're going to be working with or whoever's part of your survival group. And I do recommend that in each town, in each city, whether you're in the country or whether you're in the urban grid, the real value in your local community is not how much money your neighbor has or you have, because that's not going to be worthless in the future. That's not going to mean anything the way it means something today, now that credit is actually still being issued by design to our government so we can go further and further into the abyss of debt. The real value in your community is your ability to work with each other. It's the people in your community. And see, we are biological beings living in this grid. And with all this technology around us that has surpassed our own spirituality, we forget about basic relationships. How a lot of the aspects of survival aren't just about the individual preparation you may or may not already be engaged in, but your real hands-on ability to work with other people. So in terms of alternative communications, from shortwave radios to two-way radios, you can hear what emergency personnel is responding to in a crisis by getting a scanner at this time. You can get some models for less than $100. Cell phones are the very last thing that you want to rely on, but you also want to keep your eyes open to the old technology which still exists, like CB radios, and knowing a little bit about that and the terminology that goes along with using CB radios. And a lot of it still exists to this day, but we forgot about it as we have become collectively more dependent on the cell phone. The cell phone, which of course triangulates exactly where you are by GPS and sending that signal back to the server. And now we're reading about how the NSA has actually put in their hubs in telecommunication buildings, including San Francisco, where they have a whole floor that's just delegated out to the NSA. So the point of this whole bonus video on alexansary.com, by the way, I want to thank you for stopping by. It took me days and days to redesign the site. The purpose of this is that I felt that I had to get this information out, archive as much information as I can, and make it navigatable to those coming on my website, not because I'm looking for money or donations. As you can see, I don't even have any sponsors, and I hold a regular job. It's to get this information out to those that do need it, that do want it, before the grid goes down. I think in these, I don't like to use the term last days, but I think in this current era that we're in, on a spiritual note, I think it's important to live each day as if it were our last, and forget about the voices of dissent in our own ranks that tell us that all is lost, that we've lost everything, that they've taken everything, and they're tracking each one of us, because that's not the case. Their number one fuel source, those that are engaged in the propaganda, is fear. Fear, which is something that literally kills in multiple ways, including fear being used for propaganda to legitimize a genocidal wipeout of a third world population. So when you go beyond fear, you go beyond these boundaries which have kept us in this metaphorical prison, not just a physical one, but a psychological one. As you move forward through that, hope and your ability to comprehend a new world without a new world order is the very thing that the elites are afraid of, and that's losing their control over your mind, because this is a war for your mind. But to some degree, I also believe very strongly it's a war for your soul. Thanks for coming by the website. Check it out. More stuff will be archived in the near future. We'll talk to you next time. But we're going to go ahead and do this now. We're going to go ahead and let the cat out of the bag, so to speak. It's just like us, folks. It's just like you. Me trying to help you get out of the cage. Come on. This is what I recommend if you were to train your cat to go on trips with you, is to do it in stages. So that's the idea, is to get the cat used to being out and about.